My Lords, when the government announced a windfall tax on energy companies, the Treasury said it would bring in £42 billion. Sounds great. In March of this year, the OBR revised that figure down to £26 billion. And now the first independent study by Wood Mackenzie says it will be £16 billion. Now, these are not small figures, but it's a small example of what I think is going wrong with our economy, which is that there is a repeated readiness to do something that is popular in the short term rather than in the interests of our long-term prosperity. Now, to some degree, this is, if you like, the institutional view of a lot of our economic bodies. I've spoken many times here about the reluctance of the Treasury to take into account the secondary or dynamic effects of tax. In other words, the way in which cutting tax rates can generate more economic activities. We saw it over the 45p rate. We saw it over corporation tax. One reads that the plan that the Chancellor has for a Big Bang 2.0 in the city is being held up by the Financial Conduct Authority that is now against reversing the EU ban on short selling and all the rest of it. One reads that proposed tax cuts would fall short of the OBR. Although I have a feeling that if the government changes at the next election, the OBR will suddenly have no problem at all with borrowing the £28 billion for green investment, but we'll see whether that comes about. That's, of course, under a different sort of moral category. But the real point is that we are reluctant to do things that challenge people's intuitions, and this leads us into bad policy decisions. People are always in favour of windfall taxes because they think that somebody else is going to pay. They don't really understand that, as Ronald Reagan said, businesses can't pay tax, they can only collect them. In other words, that all taxes are passed on to consumers, to customers, to shareholders, and so on. So it's always a popular idea in the same way that the wealth tax is always a popular idea because people think someone else will be paying it. And the idea that the wealthy will not sit around waiting to be taxed, that they may move jurisdictions or retire earlier, is a counterintuitive and difficult one. Indeed, I think the real problem of our modern economy is the failure to take on some of the false intuitions caused by our maladaptations. Brian Kaplan of George Mason University did a survey where he looked at stuff that is common among all economists, left and right, that is consensual, and then looks at how that diverges from the general view of things. And he found that there were three particular areas of widespread public bias. The first is a general reluctance to understand how prices and competition work. So most people intuitively think that if prices go up, that's because it's what the seller feels like charging. As Lord Whitty just quoted, it's greedflation. Of course, that isn't the reality of how markets work, and I'm struck that the people who blame inflation on excess profits never make the converse argument that when prices fall, that is presumably then, by their own logic, the generosity of these big corporations. Of course, it's a huge rift between how things work and how most people see them as working. A second one is what he calls the make-work fallacy. Most people insist on seeing jobs as a benefit rather than a cost. Or rather, they don't understand that jobs are a means to an end, the end being greater prosperity, and hence this constant pressure on governments to create jobs, as though that is a good thing in itself. I mean, we could create jobs if we banned mechanical diggers and had, hundreds of men with shovels taking their places. It would create jobs in one sense, but it would make everybody poorer. It's a very difficult argument to get across that actually, if we are able to exploit technology, we should be able to work shorter hours while living better, and that is not a bad thing. And then there's what he calls the anti-foreign bias. People are suspicious, irrationally suspicious of imports, and are always tempted into the argument that security depends on producing everything yourself, when, of course, real security depends on sourcing from as wide a variety of producers as possible, so that you are not subject to a local shock which might as easily happen on your own territory as anywhere else. All of these things are counterintuitive. All of them have to be learned. That's why economists are ahead, if you like, of the people who haven't looked at it. One of the oddities in this whole debate is when people talk about free market dogma. I mean, free markets are the least dogmatic thing because they run up against all these intuitions. It seems completely plausible that a planned economy would work much better than one where things are left higgledy-piggledy to arrange themselves. It seems completely plausible that if you have two factories doing the same thing, a wise and disinterested committee of government experts could say, why don't you carry on with factory A, but factory B can be reclassified to something else. All of these things sound plausible, it's just that they lead to absolutely catastrophic outcomes. And so, if you like, the understanding of how markets work is the opposite of a dogma. It's a pragma. It's an application of observed experience against intuitions. But most people will stick with their guts and then reason backwards, which is why rent controls and price controls and wage controls and all the rest of it are always perennially popular. And the challenge for a government in the age of instant media is to be able to have the patience to look beyond the immediate headline and do what is right in the long run. When my noble friend Lord Griffiths was quoting all of those old chancellors, Barber and Healy and Howe and so on, none of them were in an age of Twitter. They were able to think in terms of an electoral cycle, to say judge us at the end of the 4 or 5 years on the overall package. Every one of Margaret Thatcher's privatisations was unpopular when it happened. Even the lifting of exchange controls was unpopular when it was polled in advance. But she understood that the important thing was not to look at the popularity of a policy when polled in isolation, but rather to look at the overall effect of a policy. Now, I hope that if indeed there is a change of government, there may be some longer-term thinking. I think the Labour Party could get away with things where they would be a little bit more trusted than this government. On NHS reform, on building more houses, maybe on allowing the pension age to rise in line with longevity, but only if they're prepared to look beyond the immediate headlines. Is that possible in this day and age? Well, as the poet said, forward though I canna see, I guess and fear.